colleague in Russia today. But before that, the breaking news now coming in. President Putin has invited Prime Minister Modi for the BRICS summit. Remember, as part of the multilateral summits that both the leaders have had, there have been several such. In fact, the last multilateral summit that the Prime Minister has had with President Putin was the SCO summit in Samarkand. That's where the Prime Minister had made that statement with regards to the Russia-Ukraine war. Once again, the Prime Minister reiterating India's position on this entire matter. As far as Ukraine war is concerned, sources indicating that the Prime Minister during the private dinner has essentially indicated that there cannot be any solution in the battlefield. In fact, after the bilateral talk that took place, Prime Minister once again indicating that they've had an open discussion on Ukraine. First, listen in to what President Putin had to say.
Mr. Prime Minister, we will be glad to see you we're looking forward to seeing you in Kazan this autumn at the BRICS summit. Mr. Prime Minister, we will be glad to see you we're looking forward to seeing you in Kazan this autumn at the BRICS. Mr. Prime Minister, we will be glad to see you we're looking forward to seeing you in Kazan this autumn at the BRICS summit. Mr. Prime Minister, we will be glad to see you we're looking forward to seeing you in Kazan this autumn at the BRICS summit.
Well, in fact, let me also introduce Russia Today anchor. Charlotte is joining us on this broadcast. Charlotte, thank you very much for joining us as we take our viewers through the latest developments. All eyes were on the bilateral talks that were taking place. In fact, we're talking on a day when leaders of the NATO nations will be coming together in Washington, D.C. So it would be on what the Prime Minister and President Putin have essentially spoken on the Ukraine war. Prime Minister indicating that this is not an era of war, once again reiterating that no solutions can be found on the battlefield. Charlotte, if you can hear me.
I can, yes. Hello.
I'll just repeat the question that I was asking you. We're talking on a day when 32 leaders of the NATO nations will be coming together in Washington, closely watching as to what Prime Minister Modi and President Putin has essentially discussed. Prime Minister indicating that this is not the war.
That's fine, but can you ask them to turn the feedback off my phone? Because I can hear myself when I'm talking.
We'll try and just reconnect with Charlotte if you can hear me. Charlotte, I'll just repeat the question if the question was inaudible. We'll try and reconnect with Charlotte of Russia today. She, in fact, is joining us from the iconic Red Square. In fact, both the broadcasters getting you insight as to what has really happened in Moscow with that big meeting between President Putin and Prime Minister Modi. In fact, what is also interesting to point out here is the kind of responses that have come in from the West, particularly the United States of America. You've had the US Department of State indicating that India is a strategic partner with whom we engage in a full and frank dialogue, and that includes on our concerns about the relationship with Russia. What you see right now on your screens, these are images coming in that came in earlier in the day of the Prime Minister interacting with the diaspora as well as Russian artists who've been extremely enthusiastic about the Prime Minister's visit in Moscow. In the earlier reach out that the Prime Minister has had with the Indian diaspora, he's also spoken about the relationship that India has shared with Russia, saying that it's an all-weather friend, in fact, a trustworthy ally. These are big words really coming in from the Prime Minister, especially at a time when the West was perhaps hoping that there would be a different statement really coming in from the Prime Minister. Many concerns essentially being raised also by the West with regards to the Prime Minister's visit. But the very fact that the Prime Minister has essentially chosen Russia as the first country that he is visiting after being sworn in as the Prime Minister is in itself a stamp on how important Russia is for India in terms of a strategic partnership that India is looking at. Not just that, also perhaps even the world looking at how exactly would India be responding to the current situation, hoping that India would play a pivotal role in diffusing the current situation as far as the Russia-Ukraine war is concerned. These are the latest now coming in. We'll try and see if we can go across to Charlotte, who's joining us on this broadcast. Charlotte, I'm hoping that you can hear me now. The question that I wanted to ask you is the timing of this entire meeting between President Putin and Prime Minister Modi, because this comes on a day when you've had leaders of the NATO countries coming together in Washington, D.C. Many would say there is a complete meltdown. What do you make of the bilateral talk that both the leaders have had?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, like you said, that this is happening at the same day that NATO meeting is taking place in Washington. And we know that the West is watching what's happening between this meeting between Narendra Modi and Vladimir Putin very closely indeed. In fact, we've heard already from the State Department spokesperson in the US that they've raised their concerns with India about this. Now, it's important because we have not had any announcements yet as such from the two leaders. We know that they had a very friendly and frank open chat for 4 or 5 hours on Monday evening after Narendra Modi arrived. We saw those images of the two leaders hugging each other, hanging out in a golf buggy, watching horses put on a show and then drinking tea together. And we know that Narendra Modi has said today, just before they went in for their official talks, that that discussion was frank, that nothing was off the table. I just want to talk you through some of the things he mentioned before going into those official discussions. He said that they did talk about Ukraine. He said there was an open discussion. It was a very respectful discussion. And he said that any war or conflict is not something that is good for the world today. It's not good for the future. He said when we have any civilian lives, any innocent lives, and he mentioned children in particular dying, that our heart bleeds. And he said that India was ready to be there as any form needed in regards to trying to bring around dialogue, trying to bring around a peace with solution. I don't know if that means that India could potentially be a peace negotiator or harbinger of peace in the future, but certainly he was suggesting that India will do everything it can to bring an end to this conflict. And he said what was really interesting from discussing this with President Putin is that President Putin was open about his opinions and that the two had thrashed out something that he said was evolving into incredibly interesting ideas. We might get a sense of what that is when the two signed their communique at the end of their meeting. But he also said that Putin understood that peace was needed very soon. So I think what we get a sense of is that both leaders are on the same page, that the conflict has to come to an end to stop the deaths of soldiers and civilians. And I think the two really feel that they've got this great relationship where they can have a bit of a tete-a-tete and discuss these incredibly difficult subjects.